Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, Flexport Capital, Understanding Cash Flow Conversions. My name is Quentin Purtzer, and I'm a business development lead for our capital team here at Flexport. Flexport Capital provides inventory and logistics financing to importers in North America and Europe. And today I will be chatting with John Blair, the founder of Free to Grow CFO. John will join me on stage shortly, but first a few housekeeping notes. On your screen, you will see a sidebar to the right of the main stage. If at any time you need technical assistance during the live webinar, please message us in the help chat located on the sidebar. In the menu above your screen, you have two tabs. In the first tab, you can download a copy of today's slides, and in the second tab, there's a brief feedback survey for this webinar. We'd love your feedback, so please fill that out before exiting the webinar. You can also ask live questions to the Flexport team via the Q&A tab on the sidebar. Today, in lieu of live Q&A, we will be answering questions in the writing on that sidebar. And finally, a brief legal note. Please keep in mind that all content provided in this webinar is informational and may not be customized to your specific business requirements. We recommend reaching out to a Flexport expert to discuss specific dynamics affecting your business. And with that, I'd like to invite our guest, John, onto the stage. John is the founder of Free to Grow CFO. Welcome, John.
Hey everyone, I'm John Blair. I am super excited to be here today.
John, let's kick things off with an introduction to you, your background, and what Free to Grow CFO is.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you can see from the slide, I'm a very busy guy on the personal side of the house. At the top, that picture on the top, you can see a picture of me and my beautiful wife and our three little ones, all of them under the age of 5. So man, are we busy right now these days. Originally, I'm from Southern California, Orange County to be exact, for those of you who know where that is. I've lived in Austin, Texas since 2019. And a fun little known fact about me, I used to play guitar and sing in a heavy metal band called Fate's Demise. If you don't believe me, Google it and enjoy. Thank me later. A little bit about me on the professional side of the house. So in short, my background's heavily weighted on the brand side of the world for the first decade of my career. Most recently, I was a founding team member of a brand called Guardian Bikes, which you may have seen featured on ABC's Shark Tank and is a Mark Cuban company. The picture on the bottom right of the slide, you can see a picture of me, Mark Cuban, and the rest of the top-notch early founding Guardian Bikes team. Guardian Bikes is a direct-to-consumer brand that sells the safest kids' bikes direct to your door. I serve the company as a founding team member, COO, CFO, kind of a joint COO, CFO role, from pre-revenue to healthy 8 figures in revenue, which we achieved in just 3 short years. While I was there, I handled, as COO and CFO, all aspects of supply chain, inventory planning, purchasing, fulfillment, as well as on the finance side of the house, accounting, financial projections, cash planning, and debt and equity fundraising. So with this background, I'm uniquely positioned to understand brand founders and their scaling challenges. Having come from working on the brand side for the last 10 years before I started Free to Grow CFO, I really understand brand founders at a deep, deep level. I've been in their shoes before. Fast forward to 2022, I co-founded Free to Grow CFO. We provide outsourced accounting and finance CFO services for growing direct-to-consumer brands. What we do is we provide the accounting and CFO expertise that brand founders need to scale alongside healthy profit, cash flow, and confidence, but without the price tag of hiring a full-time CFO. All we do is work with growing e-commerce brands all day long. So we're experts in that arena, and helping our clients improve cash flow through understanding and optimizing their cash conversion cycle is one of our specialties. So I'm really excited to chat about today's topic.
Yeah, and so with that, that is what we'll be focusing our discussion on today. It's all about the cash conversion cycle and why cash flow is the most important metric to track when operating an inventory-based business. Specifically, we'll cover cash flow drivers, what the cash conversion cycle is, how to calculate it, as well as tips, strategies, and products available to improve cash flows and shorten your company's cash conversion cycle.
So really quick, before we get started, I just want to add a brief caveat that this training it's not fully comprehensive. You can get really deep into the cash conversion cycle, and the different drivers of the cash conversion cycle. It also, from a cash flow management standpoint, this training doesn't focus on the more widely known profitability component of cash flow. There's tons of content out there about profitability, but there's very little that explains the cash conversion cycle. It's the lesser known, and I would argue more important component of managing your cash flow. That's what we're going to focus on today. Additionally, the typical discussions and formulas around the cash conversion cycle, they're laden with a lot of accounting and finance jargon. Today we're going to simplify everything down into more high level terms that speak to a founder, CEO of a brand, not the in-depth finance deep dive that I would do with finance professionals on this topic. um, Again, before we fully dive in, I want to just say something about why now is a great time to discuss and learn how to manage your cash conversion cycle. In the e-commerce world, where me and my CFO firm come from, we've just come off Black Friday, Cyber Monday. And so lots of the brands we work with have a pretty good sense of how their 2023 fiscal year is going to close out. And they've got a decent chance of, or decent understanding of what opportunities and challenges lie ahead of them in 2024 and beyond. Understanding your cash conversion cycle coming out of 2023 and getting into the 2024 planning season, it's a super valuable strategic planning tool. It can help you in preparing your 2024 strategic plan and inform decisions like, what capital providers can or should I use next year? What should my product roadmap look like next year? And how will that impact my cash conversion cycle? With a full year of 2023 data in hand, what opportunities do I have in 2024 to negotiate and restructure vendor terms to enhance my cash conversion cycle? And much, much more. The bottom line is, it's a great time to talk about this topic coming out of the end of the year and preparing to plan for 2024, because understanding these concepts will help you make better strategic plans for next year.
And so, why should you care about this? On top of what John said, it helps with planning, but you should care about learning for these tips on improving cash flows because, regardless of how effectively you manage and leverage your vision, your people, processes, data, if your business is constrained by limited cash flow, nothing else matters. You should care about cash flow drivers because profit and cash in your bank are never equivalent due to the cash conversion cycle. And so, about John and I, we partner together with scaling brands. John is their fractional CFO, and myself as one of his lending partners. John's specialty at Free to Grow CFO is improving cash conversion cycles, as not having enough cash in the bank account is that limiting factor to growth. John partners with Flexport Capital to help his clients extend AP days, but we'll talk more about that later.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, scaling a business is one of the most challenging journeys that an entrepreneur can embark on, which I did at Guardian Bikes. And Free to Grow CFO is now helping about 20 brands navigate those same scaling challenges. The lessons I learned at Guardian and what me and the other CFOs we have on staff walk through with our clients on a daily basis, we're going to summarize those today as it relates to managing your cash flow. And I'm excited to dive in and walk you guys through the basics of how to understand what drives your cash flow beyond profitability and how to improve it as you continue to scale.
Cool. So, with that, John, let's get started and talk about the cash conversion cycle. The cash conversion cycle is the number of days it takes to convert a dollar of purchase inventory into a dollar of cash into your bank account. The definition is simple, but there's nuance to it. The formula is broken out on your screen, but it's laden with accounting jargon. John, help us break down each component of the cash conversion cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. So to echo, I'm just going to start at the beginning. So what is the cash conversion cycle? It's the number of days it takes to convert a dollar that goes out your bank account to purchase inventory, number of days between that and when that dollar comes back into your bank account as cash received from a sale. What is it composed of? If you dig in, if you Google this term, you're going to see things like terms like DIO, DSO, DPO. I've simplified them down to kind of like non-finance terms so that they're really easy to understand. It's basically your cash conversion cycle is inventory days plus AR days minus AP days. What do each of those three components mean? So inventory is the average days of sales that your inventory levels can support. So if you have 100 inventory days, that means on average your inventory levels can support 100 days of sales. AR days are the average days it takes to collect your receivables. So if you have 35 AR days, it takes you on average 35 days to collect your accounts receivable. And then AP days are the average days it takes to pay your suppliers for inventory. So if your AP days are 40, then on average it takes you 40 days to pay your suppliers for inventory.
Got it. So that makes sense. We add the average days of inventory on hand plus the average days of AR and subtract AP days. This means hypothetically, a scaling brand wants to have the smallest amount of daily inventory on hand, convert AR as quickly as possible while taking as long as possible to pay vendors, all without running out of inventory. Walk us through that.
Yeah, so I mean, in the simplest terms, a lower cash conversion cycle equals healthier cash flow when compared to a longer cash conversion cycle. Why is that? Why do we want to see a lower number? Because again, let's go back to what cash conversion cycle means. It's the number of days between spending $1 on inventory and collecting $1 from sales on that same dollar of inventory purchased. The longer the time horizon between those 2 points, then the longer your cash is not sitting in your bank account, but instead it's sitting on warehouse shelves because of inventory days, or it's sitting in your vendor's bank accounts, that's AP days, or it's sitting in your customers' bank accounts, that's AR days. So in reality, you take a look at your P&L and you see a profit number, but then you look at your bank account and you wonder to yourself, how come that same number is not flowing into my bank account? That's because your cash conversion cycle. Some of that cash is sitting on warehouse shelves in the form of inventory. Some of it is sitting in your vendor's bank account because you paid them faster than you sold that inventory. And some of it is sitting in your customers' bank accounts because you sold that inventory, but you haven't gotten paid for it yet. So we want to see a smaller cash conversion cycle. Means you are spending $1 on inventory and getting that dollar back faster, thus increasing cash flow on average.
And that's why profits never equal cash flow, right? It depends on where that cash is sitting, regardless of if you're selling inventory profitably or not.
100%. And I'd say furthermore, when we're talking about the context of a consumer brand, right? If you're a consumer brand that is heavy in the e-commerce world, like the ones we work with,
Yeah.
inventory is always a challenge, right? And you're growing. As you're growing your brand top line revenue wise, you're always having to purchase more inventory and usually pay for it before you sell it. And so that gap in the cash conversion cycle that's created by inventory days and AP days, you're kind of always chasing it as you scale.
It makes a ton of sense. So let's talk about how to actually calculate the cash conversion cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't want to get into like too much of the I don't want to get into too much like actual examples of calculating the numbers. I'm going to stay high level because again, you can have a finance professional calculate these numbers. And if you don't have a CFO or finance person on your team, you can always reach out to Free to Grow CFO. We're doing this stuff all the time. So inventory days, how do you calculate it? You take your average inventory over a period of time and you divide into it your average daily cost of goods sold. And so what are you doing when you do that math? By dividing average daily cost of goods sold into your average inventory, you are thus calculating how many days it's going to take for your cost of goods sold to equal the inventory that you have on hand, and thus calculating the average days of inventory. So you're kind of calculating like a turnover almost. It's the same thing on the AR side, but you take average AR balance and you divide into it average days of sales. Again, calculating how many days it takes you to collect AR. And then on the AP side of the equation, again, very similar concept, but you're taking your average accounts payable balance over a period of time and you're dividing into it average daily cost of goods sold during that period. And that's giving you about how many days it takes to pay your vendors for inventory purchases.
Makes sense. John, how should a brand that has strong seasonality think about this? For example, a direct to consumer brand that has a revenue spike in Q4, should they be looking at this differently by quarter? What would you recommend?
Yeah, so here's the thing, to avoid these numbers kicking off distorted metrics, and I'm talking about to avoid calculating inventory days, AR days, AP days in a way that distorts things, you want to look at this from a few different time horizons. First off, you want to look at it from a trailing 12-month view, because when you look at it trailing 12-month, that smooths out seasonality, right? Those seasonal cycles get smoothed out. But here's the challenge with that. It gives you a 12-month average, which may not explain why your cash conversion cycle gets worse in certain periods of seasonality and better in other periods of seasonality. I don't really know a consumer brand that isn't seasonal to some degree. Certainly, a lot of them, most all of them follow consumer spending trends, but then certain, product categories have additional seasonality layered on top of them. Maybe weather is a factor, maybe there's other factors,
Sure.
other certain holidays layered on top of consumer spending. But the reality is that the way that we do it at Free to Grow CFO is we actually look at it monthly, and we you can see the seasonal we create these dashboards that connect directly into our clients financial statement system, so QuickBooks Online and Final Loop, and you can see a trailing 12-month time series showing month by month historical revenue, and then month by month historical AR days, AP days, and inventory days. So you can see in the revenue curve the seasonality by month, and then you can see underneath that, you can see the cash conversion cycle seasonality, and it helps explain why sometimes cash conversion cycle gets worse and better throughout the year. So I'll give you an example we see all the time, and it's top of mind because we're in the middle of the holiday season. All the brands we work with, generally speaking, have to stock up on inventory right before November, right? Getting ready for Black Friday, Cyber Monday, and the holiday shopping season. So in October, sometimes even September, in those months, they're building up inventory. Sales tend to be kind of down seasonally from a consumer standpoint. So you're building up inventory in a sales season where sales are down. And so your inventory days in those months are going to seem pretty high because sales velocity is down, but inventory purchases are up. But we know from looking at historical data that we're heading into a big sales season being in November and December, and that those inventory days numbers are going to come down. But what's really important about that is like when you can see that historically and you can even project it forward, because we project it in our financial models, we know that if cash conversion cycle really balloons in September and October, what does that mean? It means we're probably going to have some financing challenges, right? And
Sure.
that's why oftentimes we're partnering with a Flexport Capital or the like to bring in a line of credit where we can basically finance that cash conversion cycle for those few months so that we can strategically purchase enough inventory, but then head into the holiday season, hopefully crush our sales goals, pay that loan back, because in November and December, the cash conversion cycle usually plummets, which is a good thing. And that's because you're ringing the cash register, cash is flying in the door, and inventory levels are coming down and inventory days are shrinking.
Sales are going up, and then with the financing partner, you're able to extend those AP days, so it can really keep that cash conversion cycle in check as you're preparing for a large seasonal event like Black Friday, Cyber Monday. Uh,
Absolutely. Absolutely. So to summarize your question in terms of time horizon, trailing 12-month is the generally accepted. That's the way that they teach it in school. Look at these metrics on a TTM basis. It's helpful, but if you're in a seasonal business, it's not super helpful. You need to look at it monthly, and when you see those big fluctuations up and down, understand what that means from a financing perspective, and if there's any financing you need to consider putting in place or any tweaks you need to make to say your inventory purchasing strategy to try to smooth out inventory days and not see such big high peaks and valleys.
yeah, that makes sense. Well, let's talk about each piece of the cash conversion cycle and how we can optimize your cash flow through that. Uh, John, why don't we start there? talk about some tips, strategies to improve your cash flow.
Yeah. So before we're going to go through each component of the cash conversion cycle and talk about some specific tips. Before we do that, I just want to highlight that once a business has an even a basic understanding of what drives cash flow, it's a lot easier for them to see that insufficient cash flow is driven by either, and usually it's a and,
Nation.
not an or, but the cash conversion cycle getting going, increasing, which is a bad thing, or insufficient profitability. So the reality is that when you're not happy with your cash flow or you're concerned that cash flow might get worse, you really just need to look in four places. One, profitability. Two, inventory and whether or not you have excess inventory on hand, meaning high inventory days. Three, AR, and if you have slow turning receivables, which means high AR days. Or four, paying vendors too quickly, which means that you have low AP days. So, armed with that knowledge that what drives insufficient cash flow is insufficient profit, which we're not going to focus on today, excess inventory, slow turning receivables, and paying vendors too quickly, we can now dive into each of those components and how we can seek to improve them.
It makes sense, right? It's all about understanding the data behind your business and then making actions on it. And so the first tip that you say, where it is the most important piece of running a D2C brand that is scaling, is inventory management, reducing those inventory days.
Absolutely.
You were,
Absolutely. So
yeah,
So in terms of reducing inventory days, again, like Quentin said, we at Free to Grow CFO work with growing e-commerce brands. We don't have a lot of AR that we're typically dealing with. We do work with some omni-channel brands, but not a lot of AR. We'll touch on that, but most of the tips exist around inventory because that for a D2C brand really is the biggest challenge. But if you're a consumer brand at all, even if you have a B2B presence, inventory still is one of the biggest drivers of insufficient cash flow. So how do we reduce inventory days? These are just some tips that come from my experience scaling Guardian bikes, as well as working with clients of Free to Grow CFO. So the first one is consistently review your SKU level sales and inventory health metrics. This might sound simple, but you would just be surprised how many brands don't do this, or they don't do it frequently enough. And you need to do this consistently. If your brand is growing really fast, you need to look at daily sales at a SKU level. You can probably get away with weekly or monthly if you're not growing as fast, but you need to look regularly at how SKU level sales volume is doing. You also need to be able to look at inventory days by SKU, and you need to consistently monitor inventory dollar value by SKU. This allows you to, in more real time, if you're doing it weekly, let's say, understand which SKUs are really causing a drag on inventory and ultimately driving up inventory days. One thing that I suggest is, this is something we had at Guardian Bikes, is just create a simple inventory health scorecard. So that's SKU going down the left side and then across the top. You've got your key metrics like quantity on hand, dollar value on hand, daily sales velocity, days inventory on hand, and just regularly monitor that weekly or monthly, and you'll be surprised how much of an impact you can make on inventory days. Um, and as a brand is growing, I think the most important thing in terms of nuances for consistently reviewing SKU level sales and inventory health for a growing brand is, the faster you're growing, the more frequently you have to look at these metrics. The slower you're growing, the less frequently you can afford to. The other thing is lead times. If you have really long lead times and uncertainty on how long it's going to take to get inventory after you purchase, you need to be looking at this stuff a lot because you need to anticipate the next order. If your lead times are shorter, then, which a lot of brands we work with have fairly long lead times, but if you have shorter lead times, you can review this data less frequently. The next tip is for reducing inventory days, use the 80-20 rule to prioritize which SKUs to focus your improvement efforts on. I can't emphasize this enough. This is just a concept that applies all the way across business and trying to improve your financial situation. Like, the reality is, you can't you can't boil the ocean. You can't go after trying to improve every single SKU. You have to apply the 80/20 rule. 20% of your poor performing SKUs are producing 80% of your inventory days problems. I see this all the time when I work with a brand and their aggregate company level inventory days are too high. It's usually only around 20-25% of their SKUs that's causing the problem. Focus there first, move the needle on those. And here's the thing, once you move the needle on that 20% of poor performing SKUs, guess what? There's going to be a new 20% that pops up. And then focus on that 20% and just iterate on that and don't stop.
John, I'm curious about that. What were some of the strategies that your brands took to get rid of some of that poor performing inventory over the last few months?
So some of this depends on what your overall strategy is from a branding standpoint and how you view promotions and things like that. But you can do things like see if there's any B2B partners who are willing to purchase big bulk orders. If you're concerned about doing a really big kind of like percentage off discount, you can look at trying to bundle your SKUs that are kind of that you have excess inventory of, bundle them and offer a bundle discount. Um, and I mean, a lot of it is really, really done through promotions and marketing, um, and just being really, really thoughtful about how you can pull that off. And here's the thing: if you get really desperate, there are liquidation companies out there. You're going to get cents on the dollar, but if you're just not moving something, you can always consider going that route if needed to just turn that slow moving inventory into some amount of cash.
Sure.
Um, the next tip is improve your demand and supply planning synchronization. So what do I mean by this? I just mean that the team of people internally and externally that run your demand planning and run your supply planning just really stay in sync. When those two operations are out of sync, left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. It's just really easy to over order. It's just really easy to over order inventory when the supply planning team doesn't realize what's going on the demand planning side of the house. And so, one thing I did at Guardian that was super successful is implementing something I call a weekly cross-functional planning meeting. You bring the key players in sales and marketing, finance and ops into a 30-minute meeting, and you literally just sync on, hey, here's what we thought our sales pace was going to be. Here's what it actually is. Here's what we're expecting it to be for the next 60 to 90 days. And it's literally just a resyncing on a weekly basis to make sure everyone is seeing the trends the right way and is on the same page about like sales expectations so that finance can forecast cash flow accordingly. Operations can forecast replenishment orders accordingly, and everyone just stays in sync. And I think the last thing I see a lot with consumer brands that this is a big driver of excess inventory, not being thoughtful about how many active SKUs that you carry. This again is a 80/20 rule thing. You have 20% of SKUs that drive 80% of your revenue and your contribution margin dollars. And the reality is when you have a SKU catalog that ends up being too big for the sales velocity that you're currently at, you end up dealing with excess inventory positions. And so just remember that every additional SKU you choose to carry, it drives another layer of minimum inventory that you have to carry at all times to keep that product in stock. It makes replenishment more challenging, and you run the risk of having more SKUs in that 80% that only drive 20% of your revenue. So just be very thoughtful and strategic about how many active SKUs you carry.
Makes sense. So as you're focusing on brands that are scaling, your recommendation is generally to be doubling down on that top 20%, right? Those SKUs that are turning over quickly and focusing marketing efforts on that. And until you've really tapped out that market, double down there, and then you consider bringing on new SKUs is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, and I mean, look, don't take this as an absolute. This is
Yep.
general advice. You have to be in tune with your marketing strategy and with your ideal customer and understand repeat purchase behavior or bundle item purchase behavior. You don't want to kill an 80% SKU that you find is actually tied to a 20% SKU, but you want to be very thoughtful. There's no hard and fast rule other than if you're tracking inventory days by SKU and inventory value by SKU, and you're being thoughtful about what's in your 20% and what's in your 80%, just considering those things is going to allow you to make a lot better decisions about how big your SKU catalog is.
It makes sense. So when you get to that point where you're going to introduce a new SKU, what are the strategies that you're recommending to your brands?
Yeah, so I mean, you can do things like surveys with your existing customers and whatnot to like get a sense of how popular they're going to be. But
Yeah,
in my experience, that is like still data that can be heavily skewed and unreliable. Honestly, the most surefire way to go about it is have a limited edition run or a pre-order campaign where it's like you reduce your risk of being wrong on that new SKU and you do a limited run, which also creates scarcity, right? And so you can get some actual numbers on demand through a limited run or a pre-order, that really reduces the risk of just placing a big order for a new SKU and being totally wrong.
yeah, it makes sense. Well, thanks for walking us through inventory. I know how important that is for these brands. Let's talk about AR days. Like you mentioned, AR is not as significant in your world, given that a lot of your brands are selling direct to consumer. However, reducing the AR days is still important for these brands. And can you help walk through a few tips on reducing them?
Yeah, so if you have AR, I'm going to go through this quickly because it's not as prevalent in the D2C context, although a lot of D2C brands are going omni-channel, getting into retail, so it's helpful to know this. First tip for reducing AR days: nail down a solid credit sales process. Like 80% of the time, I see the issue is not that the customer doesn't pay, it's that the brand's process for doing a credit check, um, invoicing at the right time, invoicing the right person, and invoicing accurately. You'd be surprised how many times it's those things that cause a payment to come in late. And especially if you're working with big retailers, if you send them the wrong thing or it's not aligned with the contract, they don't even a lot of times tell you they're not going to pay it. They just reject it. And you have to figure out that they're not paying it when they're, whatever, 30 days past due. So get a solid process to invoice the right thing at the right time and send it to the right person. And then the second thing, this may sound like really simple, but again, you'd be surprised how often this is an issue. Just don't even offer paper checks anymore. 2023, about to be 2024. Just don't offer them. Take away the opportunity for anyone to play the classic, like the check is in the mail game. Played that too many times. Only accept electronic payments. And if you can, put an agreement in place that governs automatic ACH debiting or credit card charges.
Got it. Thanks, John. And so finally, we want to talk about reducing AP days. Uh, this is the final component of the cash conversion cycle. And I want to note the distinction is this is different than decreasing inventory in AR. John, why are we subtracting AP days from the cash conversion cycle?
Perfect question. Teed that one up nicely, Quentin. I mean, that is one confusing thing for people. Why are we adding? Why does inventory days increase the cash conversion cycle? AR days increases it, and AP decreases it. It's because the longer that you take to send money out the door to your vendor, the longer that money is in your bank account. And thus, it's basically financing the cash conversion cycle, right? So think of that like the cash conversion cycle is really driven in terms of an increase by how much inventory you're holding, how much AR you're holding, and your vendors in the form of AP can actually finance and improve the cash conversion cycle. So let me use a real extreme example. Amazon is known for having a negative cash conversion cycle, which is like a dream. And what does that mean? That means that their vendors are financing their inventory purchases and their accounts receivable. And I'll give you a simple example. So let's say you're a vendor to Amazon, which Guardian Bikes was at one point before we went like full D2C. Let's say they buy 30 days of inventory from me, but they pay me in 90 days, right?
Right.
That means that they're holding on to inventory for 30 days on average. So their inventory days is 30, but they're not paying for 90 AP days. So they actually have a negative 60-day cash conversion cycle, which is a working capital and cash flow dream. You're basically using your vendor's money to finance the business. I will say really quick, um, similarly, if you're doing a pre-order, right, and you're collecting AR effectively, before you've bought the inventory, you have the same impact to your cash conversion cycle, where those pre-orders, you get the cash first and then you buy the inventory. So those pre-orders actually kind of act in the same way as accounts payable do, where um your customers are financing the business. So like during COVID, when a lot of brands ran out of inventory, they had 0 inventory days because they were out of inventory, and they took a bunch of pre-orders. A lot of them were flush with cash because they had very little inventory days, and they actually had negative AR days because they had collected a bunch of money on pre-order. So that can do the same thing as AP days.
Hmm, that's interesting. So, what's the best way to reduce AP days?
So what
Increase.
you ultimately want to do, because we're subtracting it, we're increasing AP days,
Increase.
right? The classic simplest way to do this is to negotiate longer payment terms with your inventory suppliers. Now, when I bring this up, I have to throw this caveat in there that, like, I understand what it's like to negotiate payment terms with vendors, especially if you're doing cross-border transactions, you're purchasing in another country like China. It's hard, and you have to build trust, right? It's very challenging. Um, I hear a lot of brand founders kind of throw their hands up and go like, "Oh, the factory just won't give us payment terms." And I understand that it is hard, but the thing is, one, you never know until you ask, and you would be surprised by, like, just asking what a vendor will give you. And here's the other thing: every little bit helps. If you have a 30% down deposit, right? Um, Upon PO, and then 70% when it ships, if you get that deposit down from 30 to 15, that may not feel like a win, could make a huge impact on your cash conversion cycle. If you can get that, even if you can get that 30% deposit down to 20 or 25, every little bit helps. Don't be afraid to push to just even get a little bit. It's super huge. Um, and just be ready to do this consistently. Because if your brand is growing, right, maybe you've got certain payment terms today, 30% down up front, 70% upon shipment. And then maybe 6 months in, as you're purchasing more from the vendor and you're paying them on time and you're building trust, you get them to go from a 30% deposit down to 25. And then in another few months, you purchase a bunch more, you're growing, you get them to come down to 20. Like, you have to have a process to continuously come back to your vendors and show them. You have to show them how long you've been paying them on time and how much more business you're giving them. Show them, revisit regularly, and chip away at it. And over time, you'll be surprised what you can do on AP days. The other thing is, uh, don't continuously pay AP on the exact due date. Here's what I'm not saying. I'm not saying purposefully pay your vendors late, right? That's what that might sound like. What I'm saying is that, like, uh, there's no established company out there that pays AP continuously every day of the week. They all have a cutoff, right? A lot of companies, approvals will come in on a Wednesday, everything gets approved, and payments get sent out on Friday. So, like, Friday is the AP day. Implement that in your company. Um, what this does is, like, instead of paying on the exact due date, you let your cash balance build up for the week. So you're collecting down from sales throughout the week, and then you pay on Friday. If you pay at the end of the week, you've got to collect all the cash from the week and then pay everything that came due in that week on Friday. And on average, that will actually increase your cash balance. If you try to pay bills every single day, you're kind of always relying on how much cash you bring in that day. And your AP person will love you, because if you ask your AP person to pay bills every single day, it's really frustrating and it's really challenging. So pick one day, and you'd be surprised what that'll do to your average cash. The last thing, and this is going to be lead into shameless plug for Flexport Capital. It's work with, if you have done everything you can on negotiating AP or negotiating payment terms with your vendor, and you've set up a weekly or bi-monthly or monthly AP day that you process AP, but you still want to squeeze more out of your AP days, work with a lender that gives you a product, a debt product that mimics AP days. And so that's one of the reasons why earlier brands that we work with at Free to Grow CFO, we recommend Flexport Capital a lot of times, because you can have them pay your vendor, and then, 30, 60, or 90 days later, depending on what they structure, you pay Flexport back. And so you're able to basically get payment terms for a fee when you otherwise wouldn't be able to. And so you can basically, through a financing product, you can mimic um, payment terms. So, negotiate longer payment terms with your key vendors. Don't be afraid to ask, and just chip away at getting longer payment terms over time. Pay weekly, bi-monthly, or monthly, not continuously every day, and find a lender who can mimic AP days and watch the positive impact it makes to your cash flow.
Thanks for the plug, John. Appreciate it. And so, as John said, with Flexport Capital, we are working to increase growing brands AP days, right? With a 90-day financing, instead of paying your vendors, when the goods are ready at that destination or at the origin port, we will pay those vendors for you, and we'll give you 90 days, increasing on your AP, immediately lowering your cash conversion cycle, allowing you to reinvest that cash into other aspects of your business that you can, have a larger return on your investment.
Absolutely. Great product for an earlier stage growing brand. So, I mean, to close on this training that I've taken you guys through, look, now you're armed with an understanding of what drives your cash flow, and you've been given some tips on how you can improve those cash flow drivers. So, your future cash rich business awaits you. And here's my call to action: don't delay. Just go get started now on improving your cash conversion cycle. Pick one or two of the tips that I provided and start working on them. As a quick summarizing reminder, to improve cash flow, you can improve your profitability, decrease your inventory days, decrease your AR days, or increase your AP days. If the thought of diving into your financial data to break down your profitability and calculate your cash conversion cycle stresses you out or overwhelms you, and you don't have a CFO on your team, consider hiring a fractional CFO to help. As a reminder, at Free to Grow CFO, we provide founders of growing D2C brands the executive level CFO advice and expertise that you need to scale alongside healthy profit, cash flow, and confident decision making. And improving cash flow is one of our specialties. In fact, it's one of the first things that we do with every single one of the brands that we work with. So whether or not you choose to enlist the help of a fractional CFO or take a stab at this alone, I guarantee you that embarking on this journey of improving your growing brand's cash flow is going to be meaningful, and it's going to be a worthwhile step towards achieving your growth goals. So I just want to challenge you, dive in and get started today.
Sounds good. And so if you want to get in touch with John, please feel free to reach out to John at John, which is JON, at freetogrowcfo.com, or reach out directly on his website, freetogrowcfo.com. In addition to that, John runs a free cash flow course, as well as some PDF notes summarizing today's training that he will be following up and sending to all of you as a thank you for joining this webinar today. And then if you, of course, would like to learn more about Flexport Capital and our working capital financing solutions and extending your AP days, please feel free to reach out to me directly at qpurtzer@flexport.com or request a meeting with the Flexport Capital team at flexport.com/products/capital. And that concludes today's webinar. John, thank you for the insightful conversation, and we appreciate you joining us. A reminder to please fill out our feedback survey before exiting. Thank you again. I hope you all have a great day.